Well, good morning. Thank you, Andrea, and good morning, everyone. Nice to see all of you who I can see. I can only see a handful of you on my screen now that I'm sharing. I want to talk this morning a little bit about sort of how I've been thinking through what it is that the last 2 years of the pandemic might tell us about what the future might look like, particularly for those of us who are engaged in doing work serving low-income communities and marginalized populations of one kind or another. As Andrea said, I'm currently serving as director of the Public Service and Nonprofit Leadership Program at the University of New Hampshire. I'm also a faculty fellow at our Carsey School of Public Policy. I'm going to tell you a little bit more just about my own personal biography, because I think it helps you understand where I'm coming from and how I think about these issues. A lot of my academic career has been spent in schools of social work. So I've taught undergraduate and graduate social workers at a range of institutions in New York and Boston. I've also, some of you may be familiar, I think they're still using some of the poverty education materials that I worked with AmeriCorps Vista putting together. Feels like years and years and years ago now, but I helped do some of that work in the pre-service orientation stuff. So you may have actually, if I look vaguely familiar, unless it's a help wanted poster, that may be the reason that you may have seen me before. A lot of that work emerges out of my previous work, and this is super small and you're not going to be able to see the details here, and that's okay. But I spent the better part of a decade in New York City doing both direct service and advocacy work. So I worked helping coordinate a network of what were then only 500 soup kitchens and food pantries throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City. Did some work with them, did some work with emergency feeding programs attached to homeless shelters, did some work on job training programs and programs with wraparound services specifically for homeless women with kids who were escaping abusive relationships. So if you sort of think through, right, the constellation of services that population would need, we did a lot of work around that. And I also spent some time doing advocacy work at the city level during the Giuliani years, which was an era of heightened aggressive policing of homeless populations in particular, and then did some work at the state level around advocacy and access to food stamps, and actually helped the New York State Legislature change its food stamp regulations in New York State, making them able to be used in a greater array of circumstances, again, particularly thinking about people living in homeless shelters and the limited ability that they had to prepare their own food. And then finally, sort of the thing that eventually sent me off into grad school was in the 1990s. I started working around at the federal level around issues around the welfare reform debates of the mid-1990s. So I've got sort of both that practitioner's perspective and the academic perspective. And I'll draw your attention most recently to my most recent book, because it is an effort to try to bridge those two worlds. And while the audience here is specifically social workers, it really is meant to be a way for all people engaged in clinical work or direct service work or organizational work to think through how they can be more strategic and more effective in their advocacy efforts on the particular kinds of issues that they care about. All right, so let me talk about what it is that I actually have planned for us today. I want to get a little bit from you all. We'll call up a whiteboard in a second and just have you all talk a little bit about the things that you care about. I will talk a little bit about what I think sort of are the structural or the systemic impediments, why it's so hard sometimes it feels for us to get anything done, to talk a little bit about that today. I'll then talk about both sort of the ongoing crises that we are confronting and perhaps the opportunities that we may be able to see in those crises. Talk a little bit about what I think you all, each individually and collectively, can do to affect change, and then get you all finally to think about some of the things that you think you might do or might commit to doing in that case. All right, so let's start here and just get a little sense of what it is that you all most care about. So I am going to stop sharing and move to the whiteboard. And you will see, you should see, well, it looks like we didn't erase, we were playing earlier, so the muck is still there. Next to my name, you should see a little pull down menu that says, oh, Andrea, remind me what the pull down menu says next to my name. Or anybody if you see it. It says you're seeing Stephen Pimpare's screen and there's a little pull down
view
menu.
Options.
View options, click on view options, and then it says annotate, and that'll pull up a little menu. Click on the text box, and this is what I was doing anyway, other way, right? Click there and you can type in the text box. Let me see if I can now erase the gobbledygook I put in there, and just write in what is the issue or the population group that you are most interested in serving. There we go. Great, good. We're seeing some answers come in. Healthcare for all low-income populations, survivors of domestic violence, K through 12 education, neurodivergent populations, seniors, people of color, low-income youth, refugees. Excellent. Keep it coming. And I'm going to just sort of spread things out so we can see them a little more clearly. Children, mental health, educational equity, undocumented peoples. Great, keep it coming. I know we got more people in the room that I've seen answers. More healthcare. Right, and I should point out both that this is anonymous and there are no right or wrong answers. This is mostly just sort of getting a sense of the kinds of things that people care about and to get that in your head as we talk through the rest of the stuff, right? So let's take just another couple of seconds. Somebody determined to try to draw. Which you're welcome to if you can figure out a way to make it legible. Somebody giving us a smiley face, much appreciated. Thank you. All right, so while folks continue to do that, and I encourage you to do that as you think about issues. Now what I would like you to do, please, and if you would choose a different color, if you'll see in your little bar where it says format, you should see a little blue square. Right, click that, make that any other color other than the blue that everybody currently wrote in, right? And next to your issue, right, indicate whether it's a national issue primarily, a state issue primarily, or a local issue primarily. So put an N for national, an S for state, or an L for local. Right, as you think about sort of your issue or your population group and you think about the kinds of change that you would like to see, where mostly would that change happen? Right, so great. So we're seeing some N's, we're seeing lots of N's. Could circle back around to this later. I might want to argue with you about the K through 12 education being primarily national, but that's good fodder for conversation down the road as we think through sort of how power and money is distributed in some of these issues. Food insecurity for immigrants, we've got an L. Houseless children, an L. People of color, national and local. Undocumented community members, national and local. Mental health, national, state, and local strikes me as totally fair. Although that's cheating, of course, because I asked for primary responsibility, but I'll allow it. All right, let's take just another couple of seconds if you had an opportunity. And I'm going to go back to the slide deck. All right, keep that in the back of your head. Or, in the front of your head if you would like. Let me go back to the slides. Whoops. I'll give you a full screen. Okay. So here's part of the reason for that. Is it seems to me that the very first step in effective advocacy is understanding clearly where you most need to be directing your energy, right? And we'll talk a little bit later about the different forms that energy
All right,
can
I'm just
take.
gonna.
So you probably know this, you likely know this, right? But government power is unusually divided in the US system. And again, I think most people sort of know this, but I think we actually don't think about it enough, right? And I'll say over and over again in various ways throughout this presentation how important I think it is for us to think strategically if we want to be effective. This is part of it, part of that, figuring out where the decision making or the policy making space for your issue or your population group is most concentrated, and thinking about how you in turn concentrate your own energy in the appropriate place, in the place where you are most likely to have leverage, right? And again, to underline the point of this complexity, there are lots of governments in the United States. If we count local, county, state, and federal, and like weird cross-jurisdictional things, more than 90,000 separate governments in the United States that have taxing and spending authority, right? That gives us somewhere in the neighborhood of 520,000 elected officials across the United States. Right. And again, one of the ways in which this plays out, think back to the 2020 election. There were somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,500 separate institutions that had responsibility for carrying out the 2020 elections. Right. Enormously complicated system. Right. But it's even more complicated, of course, by other basic features. And again, these should, I'm hoping, if you had some good civic education in high school or ran across a politics course in college, this I hope will be a little bit familiar. Federalism we've talked about, right? That's the division of power between levels of government. The Constitution does the national and state division of power stuff, and then state constitutions usually then decide what powers the state government has and what powers the local governments and the local counties have. And to make it even more exciting and fun, this is of course different in every state and often different in every city or town or county, right? More than this, we've got separation of powers, right? Which divides the power by function. And then on top of that, we've got, again, what I hope is another familiar phrase, checks and balances, right? Which gives each of those separate institutional authorities not only some control over their own domain, but some role in the operation of one or more of those other branches. Right, so this is sometimes referred to as separated institutions sharing power, or as I like to think of it, a government at war with itself. Right, this is literally the way the system is designed to function. So you've got at the national level, the House fighting the Senate, and the Senate fighting the executive, and the executive fighting the courts, and so on. All right. But it's, of course, even more complicated than that, right? Because it's not just those formal institutions, either in the national or the state constitution. We've got all of these other players as well, right? Almost any effort at policy making or policy change is going to involve some or all of the institutions that we've drawn attention to here. And each of these may have its own preferences, its own timetable, its own role in trying to enact or inhibit legislation. Court decisions on top of this, executive decision-making, rule-making in bureaucratic agencies, right? On and right, I could give you 7 more slides with additional lists of institutions or people or players who are involved in this process, right? Again, this is part of being strategic, is understanding as much as you can the full complexity of who's engaged in working for or against the policy that you are interested in, right? So this kind of complexity is really unusual if we look at the political systems of other rich democracies. And maybe this is a hint as to why the United States has such a radically weaker welfare state and higher rates of poverty, higher rates of child poverty, higher rates of elderly poverty, higher rates of maternal mortality, lower rates of life expectancy, higher rates of incarceration, yada, 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 right? Maybe it's something about the structure of the system itself that is a consequence of that. So what you're looking at here is a super, I know it doesn't look simple in trying to look at this now, but it's sort of a simple layout of sort of all of the rich democracies' political system and showing how many veto players are in each system. And a veto player is nothing more than a place in the formal policymaking system that allows you to stop things from moving forward, right? So these are sort of gates, right, that you have to go through, right? We have more of those than any other rich democracy, right? Just by our basic constitutional structure, right? So it's harder to get anything done, but it's radically easier to stop things from getting done. And that, I'll say that one more time because I think that's hugely important, right? The consequences of this system is that it is harder to get things done, but easier to stop things from getting done, right? There is always an advantage in the US system, especially at the national level, to people who want to obstruct over people who want to enact, right? And again, I think that basic structural factor, for me anyway, helps make sense of a lot of national politics and why things are playing out the way that they're playing out, right? So when you hear people complain about gridlock, I'm not saying you got to like it, but I am saying that you have to understand that it is in fact a feature in the design of our system, not a bug, not an aberration. Right? The US constitutional system, in my view, and that of an awful lot of other political scientists, is intentionally designed to frustrate the ability of even a determined majority to exert its will. Let me say that one more time. US constitutional system intentionally designed to frustrate the ability of even a determined majority to exert its will. Right? That's the takeaway, right? It's super complicated, right? It's hard to affect change. And even when it does happen, it tends to happen slowly and incrementally over long periods of time. And I think that's really important for us to recognize and to accept so that we don't go out into the world with unrealistic expectations of how much change can happen and how fast. Progress, especially as it relates to the marginalized populations we tend to be serving, is almost slow and hard fought. And if you have naive expectations about what you can do and how you can do it, you're going to be disappointed, you're going to be discouraged, and ultimately you're going to wind up getting burnt out, right? So to use the old cliche, remember that we are generally engaged in a marathon rather than a sprint. And of course, again, it's even worse than that, right? Because layered on top of all of that sort of institutional complexity is the fact that we are right now inhabiting this extraordinary historical moment and are confronting at least 3 massive, literally existential crises, right? The climate emergency, which gets more urgent every day I pick up the paper and read more analysis from more new scientists, right? A still ongoing pandemic that continues to have disproportionate impact, particularly on low-income communities of color, and the democratic backsliding that we're seeing not just in the US, but a concomitant rise of fascist movements around the globe. You take all of that together and things seem really bad, right? So obviously, right, there's no hope. We might as well pack up our bags and just find something else to go off and do with our lives, right? I'll just stop talking right here and we can go all do. No, of course, that's not where I'm going, right? Let me talk about the flip side of that, right? Sort of let me look for the spaces where I think there actually is another way of thinking about this as a hopeful moment, right? We have seen over the last just 2 years, right, extraordinary evidence of what government can do to help people thrive, right? So we've got the more than $2 trillion CARES Act enacted in March 2020, the $900 billion pandemic relief bill of December 2020, a $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan of March 2021, and a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill of November 2021. We're talking a $6 trillion infusion of resources that altogether mark what I think is an historic expansion of the US welfare state and the US regulatory state. And lots of the provisions, not all of them to be sure, but lots of the provisions of these bills, again, disproportionately benefit poor and low-income people and the organizations and programs that serve them. One of the consequences of this is that 2021, right, still in the midst of a world historic, right, century event in the pandemic, we saw the largest single declines in recorded poverty rate for as long as we have been calculating such things. Never before in our history have we seen as radical a decline in poverty. Especially the expansion of the child tax credit may be the single most effective policy intervention in modern US history after Social Security. Right. That is not a trivial achievement. Moreover, right, what it resulted in, look at that red line, right? That's our current recession. And then look at that dark blue line, that's the Great Recession, right, after the housing crash, right? All of that together has helped bring us to a radically faster recovery from the pandemic-related employment crash than in previous recessions, right? So there's a lot, I think, of really powerful lessons there. And, you know, we can try to pull apart whether that has or has not contributed to the inflation that we're seeing right now, if anybody wants to walk down the macroeconomic path. But even if that's the case, right, we are seeing the power of a committed federal government to do things differently, right? And to mitigate the harm that external events like a pandemic cause to people, right? On top of this, right, if we think about the Black Lives Matter movements, particularly of 2020, right, the most widespread and sustained mass mobilizations absolutely since the 1960s, and quite possibly the largest and most sustained protests in all of United States history. Add on to that the ongoing strikes and job actions that we're seeing, right? The so-called Great Resignation, right? Workers thinking that they may have power and influence now that they didn't have a couple of years ago and looking to better their conditions, right? That is, I think, extraordinarily hopeful. And again, on top of that, right, we've got, I think, lots of indications of a deeply engaged citizenry at the moment, right? 2020 saw record high turnout, the highest voter turnout since the early 1900s. One of the consequences is that we've still got a long way to go, I want to say, but still have the most racially diverse Congress in all of our history. We have the most women serving in the national legislature. We're still way behind other rich democracies, but nonetheless, more women serving in Congress than ever before in our history. We've got more out self-identified lesbian, gay, and bisexual people serving at the national level than ever before in our history. And at the state and local level, we are seeing out trans people occupying positions of high elected office. On top of all of that, and this I'm going to frame as a thing that I think is a good thing, although people may disagree, we have what I see as a growing recognition of the failures of the US Constitution. And I think what I see as mainstreaming of conversations about the necessity for major reforms, right? And you see this in people talking about fundamentally altering the way in which the United States Supreme Court works, right? Arguably our most undemocratic institution, right? And again, as a political scientist who has been complaining about the failures of these institutions for decades now, it gives me hope that we could be turning a corner. You combine this citizen engagement and activity with a growing recognition that our institutions maybe aren't serving us well, right? And aren't serving the majority well, right? Maybe that's a good thing. So, right, to haul out the old cliche, right, from Tale of Two Cities, right? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, it was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like it could be describing the current moment, right? So maybe if we put all of this together, the bad and the good, maybe like on the eve of the French Revolution, it is both the best and worst of times, and that this is one of those historical fulcrum moments in which there is real possibility to fundamentally alter the imbalances in the system that disproportionately affect, again, sort of, this is my history. I do most of my work on poverty and homelessness, so I'm particularly interested in the well-being of low-income communities of color in particular. All right. So what does all of this mean for us, right? What does this tell us about the current state of politics and policymaking? And what lessons can those of us working with those populations take away from this extended series of crises and this moment of potentially positive change that will help us all advocate for and enact policies that improve the well-being of the people and the places that we care about, right? So let me walk through what I think are some very particular lessons that I take away from this moment, right? First, decades of work are usually what lie behind overnight change, right? The child tax credit, which I made reference to earlier, which is primarily responsible for those radical declines in poverty rates. That's something that US House Representative Rosa DeLauro has been fighting literally for 2 decades, since she first got into Congress. She has been slogging away, trying to change the debate and waiting for an opportunity to enact her policy proposals. So even in a moment of emergency policymaking during the pandemic, right, those expanded child tax credit policies that we enacted into law for a brief period of time were only available to be considered and adopted because of people like DeLauro working tirelessly over the long haul. That goes back to what I said earlier also about this being a marathon rather than a sprint, right? That radical improvement in the well-being of American children in particular took 20 years worth of work to get us ready to do that. Lesson 2 for me. A lot of the things that we've historically been told for so long are just impossible, right? We can't have a child tax credit. We can't have a universal basic income, yada, 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 right? Well, they turn out not to be impossible at all, it turns out, right? We may be in the midst of a fundamental transformation in US social policy and how we think about what government can and should do. But if that change is going to be sustained or reinvigorated, it's not going to happen by magic, right? All the more reason, right? We're not going to be able to do it. We're not going to be able to do it by snapping our fingers, right? It's all the more reason to keep pushing and pushing and pushing for the things that you care about and look for those open spaces, right? In that regard, never underestimate the power that we all have when we act together in public acts of defiance. Movements matter. And there is, I would argue, no important advance in US social, political, or economic policy that doesn't ultimately have mass protest and disruption at its center. Lesson 4. I think that one of the things that the coronavirus pandemic has reminded us of is that there is actually no such thing as a natural disaster, right? It wasn't a disaster for everybody, remember, right? Many of those people who could work from home, right, actually saw their financial status improve because they kept their jobs, right, and their income, but they saw their expenses decline, right? Crises like this reveal the already existing fissures and flaws in our social support systems, right? I think that's one of the things we really learned from watching the disparate impact of the pandemic across disparate populations, right? But I think that's the opportunity that it creates for us too, right? To more clearly see where are those fissures, right? Where is the work that most needs to be done to make people less vulnerable to those kinds of crises in the future? Put differently, tragedy or crisis sometimes reveals things that we otherwise don't see or don't pay attention to, right? Very much in that vein. Maybe I like to think that we have learned some important lessons about the ways in which people who do the most vital and important work are in fact often the least valued in our political and economic systems. And we could change that. We could totally change that, right? And reduce that imbalance. Lesson 6, partisan polarization structures everything now at the national level, and more that's moving into the state level too, right? I used to, since I'm obviously, and maybe not obviously, I'm in New Hampshire, and I've been, when I first moved to the state 6 years ago, I was able to say to students, well, one of the things that's really great about New Hampshire right now is that for the most part, you don't see the same kind of sort of strict, harsh partisan divides at the state level as you see in the national level, and there are greater spaces at the New Hampshire state legislature for policymaking than there might be in other places. That's less and less true, unfortunately, as the years go by. We're seeing more and more of that national level hyperpolarization spilling down onto the local level. There's an important point to make about this, right? This polarization, this is the formal political science language, we refer to this as asymmetric polarization, right? And by that, what we mean is that the United States Republican Party has moved radically to the right, whereas the Democratic Party has either not moved much at all or moved slightly to the left, right? So the consequence of that, and that's what you see here, these two red dots looking at national political parties around the world, right? The United States Republican Party right now is one of the most radical right-wing parties on the planet, while Democrats remain center, maybe center right, maybe center left, depending on which database you're looking at. And I know that sounds like bias. That's simply accurately describing what we know to be true from the way in which political scientists now for decades have been trying to measure differences among parties around the world, right? Seventh, we have, I hope, been reminded of the value of competent and well-resourced government itself, and the ways in which we should invest and reward dedicated, effective public service. Again, I would love to think that we have learned that this is really important stuff, right? Even if we're only thinking about public health agencies, right? That we really need to invest in those agencies and the people who are doing the work there, right? Because we will all sooner or later come to count on that. And we want it to be effective. We want it to be efficient, but we want it to be sufficiently resourced that it can serve us well. And finally, among the lessons, right? I think that, and this is hardly an original thought, but the coronavirus pandemic, I think, was in many ways a preview on a relatively small scale of the disruption that is bearing down on us as a consequence of climate change. And some of that disruption is already baked in right now. There's not a damn thing that we can do to stop it, but there is a lot that we can do to stop it from getting worse than it needs to be, right? But again, going back to what I think we can learn from the pandemic, big, fast, smart change is absolutely possible. It's absolutely possible because we have just done it, right? So what can you do, right? How do you think about, all right, you're gonna take a piece of whatever it is that you're most interested in and push that forward, right? So super basic, right? Develop your own expertise, right? If you would like to be taken seriously, you need to know what you're talking about. And that means whatever the issues or the population groups that you identified earlier as most important to you, you need to keep up with the research and the practice and the best practices in that area. You need to keep up with the policies that are being enacted or that local, state, or national legislatures are threatening to enact. You need to keep up with the work that local community organizations are doing. Right? You need to know, you don't need to know everything about everything, right? But if there's a particular population group or a particular geography or a particular set of policies that you most care about, think about ways to set aside a little bit of time every day or every week to refresh your own knowledge, right? Of what work is being done and by whom, what's working less well, right? And how do you keep on top of that? That's also going to make you more effective as an advocate, right? If you can demonstrate that you've done your homework, right? Super basic thing, you should know who represents you, right? So if you don't currently have the ability to name off the top of your head your assuming for the moment that everybody here is actually in New Hampshire, right? Who our 2 United States senators are and who your own United States House representative is, right? This is, and there are a million places like this on the web, but this is one place to go, plug in your address. It will tell you who represents you, right? One of the most basic facts of effective advocacy is, I'm going to slightly overstate this, right? People who don't represent you don't care what it is that you have to say or what you think. Because you've got nothing they want when all is said and done. If we're being super practical about this, what does an elected official want? They want votes and they want money, right? Maybe you can give them money, right? But you can't vote for them if it's some United States senator from another state, right? Focus your attention on the people who are obligated to represent you as a constituent, right? And you should know this at the state level as well, right? This is super easy here in New Hampshire, right? And you can follow that link at Ballotopedia, which, by the way, is a spectacular resource for all kinds of things. Again, plug in your address. It will tell you who all of your representatives are at the federal, state, and local level, right? And you should know that. Right? Because again, if you're thinking strategically, right, you want to know what level of government is responsible for this thing that I am most interested in making better, and who are the people in positions of power that have influence over that thing. It's also, again, super easy in New Hampshire. The general court, what we call our state legislature, does a spectacular job of making legislative activity accessible and available. And again, go to the general court website. You can search for bills in a million different, with probably a million is a slight exaggeration, I'm going to say, in dozens of different ways, right? In order to write sort of keywords for things that you care about. A little more advanced, but you could set up notifications for these kinds of things as well. So as legislation comes up, if you're interested in, I don't know, kids aging out of the foster care system, right? If you spend a little bit of time up front, you can also use any number of different kinds of services to push information to you about work that's being done in that area, so you're aware of what's going on. With that knowledge, right, call. right? And I think we live in a world, and I'm guilty of this too, even though I am older and sort of sit awkwardly on the cusp between Gen X and Boomer. I am Gen X, by the way. I'm not old enough to be a Boomer. I want to make perfectly clear, but just missed it. There's I think often I'm the same way too. It's like, why on earth would people call me? That's appalling. Text me or email me, for heaven's sake. That said, if you've got any fear over the phone, get over it, because that's a much more effective way to reach out to elected officials, right? Precisely because it takes more effort, right? And that's a good truism as you think about advocacy activities. The lower level of effort required, the less impactful it's likely to be, right? So if someone gives you a petition to sign and you're in support of it, sure, sign it. Is that likely to have much impact? It is absolutely not. Is it likely to be harmful? Probably not. But again, think about how easy it is to do that. People on the receiving end of that are generally not stupid. They recognize that that's a super easy thing for people to do, so they don't read that as a measure of your commitment and your seriousness. Picking up the phone requires a little more effort, right? Actually sitting down to write in your own words. And this is important, right? If an advocacy organization is sending around a template, right, for we want you to reach out and contact people about this issue, turn it into your own words. Turn it into your own words, right? Because again, that takes more effort and more thought and more care. People know that. Whereas if all you're doing is forwarding along someone else's language, well, that doesn't necessarily tell me how much you care about this or how important it is to you, right? Again, this is a thing super easy in New Hampshire, less easy in other places. Show up to testify, right? For good or ill, every bill that any member of the the New Hampshire General Court introduces gets a hearing. And those hearings are open to the public, and you can show up and sign in and either just register your presence and whether you're for or against the bill, or you can sign in to speak, right? Typically 3 minutes is the max, right? Again, because that requires more effort and more bravery, right? For anybody who's uncomfortable with speaking in a public or semi-public forum in that way. And again, people recognize that, right? It's like, wow, this person must really care about this. And again, using the example of children aging out of foster care, right? If that's the kind of work you do and you possess expertise, that will carry weight. And I have seen it at the New Hampshire committee hearing level. Representatives change their votes based on information they gather from people who come to testify about a bill. Right. Remember, we have a volunteer legislator. We pay them, right, $100 a year plus travel expenses. Right. So they're volunteering their time. Right. Most of them, if they're not retired, have full-time jobs. They don't have staff. The House members don't have any staff at all. Senators share staff among them. You might quite literally have information and knowledge that they are unaware of, right? So this is not sort of merely rhetorical or performative. This really can affect outcomes. Super obvious thing, right? Voting. Is voting enough? It is absolutely never enough. It is the bare minimum, right? Vote, make plans to vote, make sure your friends have plans to vote. If there are opportunities with organizations and populations that you care about to help other people get to the polls, right? If people need to be driven there, the people with disabilities who need help accessing and filling out mail-in ballot, right? There's all kinds of work that you can do, not just to commit yourself to showing up. And by the way, for every election, right? So we're not talking just presidency and Congress here. We're talking local mayoral races or school board races, or if there's a planning board race, right? Show up for all of that, make that a habit of a thing that you do, and become slightly annoying to your friends and family to make sure that they are doing the same thing as well. Right. And I would say do that work, even if you don't think they will vote in the way that you will, because I am still old and naive enough to believe that healthy democratic systems benefit from broad-based participation, even from people who disagree with me, right? I think that's an important part. If we're committed to healthy democracy, we need that. So we should be encouraging all people to get to the polls, right? And obviously, if you think that you can educate or inform them in line with your preferences, obviously do that work, right? Having done that, right? Share this knowledge with others, let other people know what's at stake. There's all kinds of door-to-door canvassing opportunities available through all kinds of local organizations, right? This is, if you look at the political science literature about how to affect the outcome of elections, this is about the only thing we actually see consistently having strong effects, both in getting people to the polls and in persuasion. Personal, one-on-one communication that is not aggressive, that is not judgmental, right? But that opens up space for meaningful conversations with people, right? Contribute money to campaigns, right? Doesn't have to be a lot, $1, $5, $10 if you can afford it. Couple of advantages there. First of all, when you call, you can say, I am a constituent and a donor, right? Which lets them know, right, that you're paying attention and you're engaged. And also, and this can be a mixed bag, but will get you on all kinds of email lists. So and it really can be a mixed bag, let's be clear, but it will also get you like regular newsletter updates from those elected officials to let you know what they're working on and what's going on in their mind that's important to your community. And you can then respond, right? We talked a little bit about this earlier, right? Inside politics is not enough. Again, will assert my claim that there is no significant advance in US social welfare policy or civil rights that was achieved without large numbers of people in disruptive process pressing on the system to do things it didn't want to do. And again, when you do that, and I cannot recommend this thin little book highly enough, think about being strategic, right? Merely making noise or showing up in a place with a sign or a funny hat is insufficient. You've got to do it in such a way that disrupts the ordinary ways of doing business and forces people in power to pay attention to you. As part of this, right, look for opportunities to do the work of bringing people together, again, who care about the populations or the communities that you care about. Effective politics is always a group activity. Always a group activity in my mind. And very much in that vein, right? As part of that work, look for ways that you can help build networks of mutual aid, right? Helping to ensure that people have their basic needs met so that they can then think about how they build power, right? But you can't get people to think about building power if they don't have enough formula in the house to take something in the news in the last couple of days, right? Nobody can focus on politics if they're worried about whether their kid is hungry, right? So you got to think about helping people meet those basic needs. And then finally, for now, right, don't just work to elect others. Think about stepping up and stepping into those roles yourself, right? And again, New Hampshire makes this super, super easy. There are so many places that are often begging for people to run for, literally begging people to run for office because they can't get enough people to do it, especially in smaller towns and localities, right? And if you're under 40, and if you don't know it, Google a thing called Run for Something, which is an organization that will help you think through all the stuff that you need to do for one of these offices. And remember, right, to go back to what I said earlier and to use the cliche, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint, right? Politics is a strong and slow boring of hard boards. Consistent pressure applied over long periods of time is how most change in the United States happens. Okay, so let me get me to shut up here. And I'm going to put up another whiteboard. Clear. Oh, excellent. That worked. So using the text feature again, if you would, and this should pop up here anonymously. What are you willing to do? Right? What will you commit to doing right now? Something small, something medium-sized, something large, doesn't matter, right? One thing right now that you will commit to yourself, this is not to us, right? This is committing to yourself that you're gonna do that will help you move forward in being more effective in helping the populations or the areas that you care about. Good, someone says research the issues, right? So build up your own knowledge and get to know a little better. Voting. So the person who said use your voice, say a little bit more. What does that mean for you? How are you going to use your voice? And to whom and where? Good. Yep. Who are your representatives? Right. Know that. You should all get to the point where you know that off the top of your head at every level of government. Right. Good. Phone banking, right? Contact local political organization of your choice. Right. And see if they've got work that needs to be done. I promise you they do. Right. So you're willing to get on the phone for candidates or for issues. Right. Good. Right. Sort of have conversations with leadership in your own organizations or programs about the things that they might be doing to help maybe the populations that they serve. Rallies, protests, marches, so that public display. Right. Right. Testifying, excellent. Legislative session is alas closed now, but there will be plenty of opportunities starting again in the fall. Really more likely the spring, right? Because they mostly introduce bills in December and start holding hearings in January in New Hampshire. Call your representatives, yeah. Yep, start talking to people, right? Who you are. It's like, hey, are you aware of this thing? Let's keep this going for just another minute or so, and then we'll close this down and turn to questions. I have not, I explained to the team earlier that I am terrible about multitasking, so I literally have no idea what's been going on in the chat. So we'll get Andrea and others maybe to pull up some questions. Actually, if you want, Andrea, do you want to start doing that while we let folks finish filling that in? And then I'm going to close this down just so that I can see people.
Yeah, absolutely. So one question that we do have, Stephen, is, you know, you talked about changing and altering that language from a script that you're given and that how that can be very effective. What are your thoughts on changing phone call scripts?
Very much the same, right? Because again, if it's, you know, if I pick up the phone and it's the 11th call that I've gotten, people using exactly the same words, right? You can fill in the rest of that sentence yourselves, right? What does that tell me about the commitment of this individual or the knowledge of this individual or the work that this individual is willing to put in on the issue, right? So I would say, you know, make it your own, right? Hi, I'm calling, you know, and if you know there's a mass campaign going on, you know, hi, I'm calling to talk to you about issue X. I know you may have heard from a lot of people about this, but I want to make an argument to you that maybe you've not heard before. Or I want to tell you what my own experience is as someone who works with this population, right? Sort of think about what is it that could make someone want to listen to you, right? What do you bring to the table, right? Now, that said, If you don't have the time, you don't have the energy to do that, but you do have the energy to call in and read the script, is that better than nothing? I think it's better than nothing. I think it's honestly not a whole lot better than nothing, if I'm being perfectly honest. Right. Again, think of that sort of equation, right? The less effort you put in, the less impact it's likely to have.
Thank you for that. So several people are asking if you have recommendations for podcasts, because that is a way in which they can really learn best and take in all of this information. So you may not have them off the top of your head, but maybe if you are able to put together a list, we can also share that with the attendees.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm seeing someone, I'm just now glancing at somebody mentioned Civics 101, which is great and super bite-sized, right? Let me think on that. I will confess that a lot of the political podcasts that I listen to are probably more in the weeds than you want. They tend to be, right, like other political science professors, you know, sort of talking all political science professory, which is not always the most accessible stuff in the world. But let me think on that. And if there are other people who have come across things that they think are more general and more accessible, throw those in there as well. I will also say that just in terms of local, you know, there is no media institution for which I don't have complaints. That said, I think particularly when we think about local politics, NHPR does an okay job, and they've got very a variety of podcasts. You can also sort of listen live on an app if that's the sort of thing you do. And then there's lots of sort of print stuff. The Concord Monitor does okay with state level stuff. If you're in Manchester, as I am, Manchester Inklink does a good job covering local issues. They actually have, I think, spectacular coverage of local homelessness issues, which is unusual, I think, in all sorts of places. There's also a New Hampshire Bulletin, which is an online web resource that is relatively new, that does, I think, a good job of covering state level issues and in-depth New Hampshire. And again, these are print publications rather than podcasts that also, I think, do a nice job in sort of bite-sized format covering local issues.
Thank you.
Yes, and someone suggesting signing up from emails, 100%
Yeah.
from your local elected officials.
So at this moment, any other questions, please put them in the chat and we'll continue to work through those.
Yeah, or if you want to like raise your hand or your virtual hand and unmute and jump in, you're welcome to do that as well.
Somebody just brought up a really great point that the majority of people on this call are younger and comfortable with the digital world. But to remember that the state is the majority Gen X and older. So maybe we can talk about how we can mesh those two.
Yeah, that's an exceptionally good point. Oldest state in the United States of America, I believe that's still true, right? And second,
Maine is number
oldest.
one.
Has Maine beat us now? And you know, if you've ever been to the State House or been to a committee meeting, you will see that is also our elected officials, right? Last I looked, the average age of a New Hampshire House member is approximately 174, if I remember right. I am kidding, obviously, and you know, don't mean that to be ageist, but I think it's problematic, right? Because that is only giving a narrow view and slice. If we think about broad representation, right? That ain't it, right? And if we want the state to be friendlier to younger people, if we want people to stay here and to raise families, then we also need to have political systems that reflect their needs and their wants and their desires, right? So I think that one of the things that you can do is foreground your generational position, right? Or your gender position, or your gender identity position, or your racial identity, right? To say, you know, I recognize that New Hampshire is disproportionately older and white, but as a person who identifies as X, I want to share with you my view on this issue, right? And again, think about sort of how I laid out, right? You don't want to be aggressive. You don't want to be confrontational. The goal here is not to demonstrate your moral superiority, but to open up space in order to get people to listen to you and to take you seriously, right? And to recognize that you may know something that they don't. Going back to what I said earlier, right? Most members of the New Hampshire, no member of the New Hampshire House has staff. They don't have offices. They don't have office phones. So if they've published their phone number online, and most of them at this point have, you are calling either their cell phone or their home, right? And I have had the experience of calling a state rep and having their mother pick up the phone, right? And that's not an unusual experience, right? But that's also a huge advantage, right? Because that creates a level of accessibility.
Mm-hmm. A clarity point, Stephen, if you are able to speak to it, is why? What makes New Hampshire, or why is New Hampshire the second oldest state in the country?
Some of that is just, it's retirees, right? It's people moving from other states up here for, right? I mean, some of it is, right, we have no income tax, so they're escaping taxation, right? We have no sales tax, so they're escaping taxation in another way. We have all sorts of beautiful outdoor spaces, right? So lovely place to retire to, right? If you want a little house on a lake somewhere, and you have the money to afford such a thing, right? It's a lovely place to do that, right? So it winds up, we've sort of attracted lots of retirees, and we have not done a great job of keeping young people in state, right? For a whole set of complicated reasons. Why does the legislature wind up being older? That goes back to what I said earlier about the fact that it's a volunteer legislature, right? So who is it who has the time to do that? Disproportionately people who are retired, right? Or who maybe run their own businesses and can build a flexible schedule, or students, right? And I've had students who have run for and been elected to the state house, you know, and that the challenge then is arranging their schedule so they're available for when their committee meets. But again, you know, sort of those two groups have more flexibility than, you know, if you are working a 40-hour week for some organization that requires you to be present 9 to 5, right?
Absolutely. And if you would just want to take a moment, somebody is very interested in your research with low-income policy, and they're curious to know if you have findings from your own research, and or what research have you done into that?
Here, let me go back to, did I add this in the deck? I didn't. Shame on me. I was gonna have a clever little slide that showed you all of my books. So honestly, the easiest thing I would say is Google me, because a lot of stuff, most of my work is historical analysis of poverty and homelessness with an eye toward looking for lessons for the contemporary period, right? So my first book, which came out of my doctoral work, was looking at efforts at rolling back municipal city level poor relief programs in the late 1800s, and making an argument that tells us something about what was going on with welfare reform in the 1990s. And I made the argument that sort of this was presented as mostly sort of a moral argument, but really what was going on here is people trying to push low-income people out into the labor market in order to depress wages, right? My second book is called The People's History of Poverty in America, probably the most accessible of my books. And that is meant to be sort of a retelling of the history of poverty and homelessness, only instead of doing what we usually do, right, which is, right, tell it as a story of great men and women, right? Here's what Jane Addams did, here's what FDR did, here's what the New Deal did, here's what the Great Society policy programs did. It's ask the question, what happens if instead we ask, how has the experience of being poor and in need changed over time? So that explicitly sort of bottom-up perspective, and I'm drawing on diaries and newspaper stories and journals and that sort of stuff. Third book was a history of images of poverty and homelessness in the movies, starting from the silent era up to the present, sort of trying to make arguments about what the culture has been telling of us about poor people. And I would argue how dangerous that has been to policymaking, because we're building policy based on cultural stereotypes. And then I've already made reference to my most recent book, which is sort of politics for practitioners, is another way of thinking about that. And if you've got, particular questions, or you want access to an article you come across that you don't have access to, send me an email and I'd be happy to share that with you.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. So at this point, does anyone else have any questions that we would like to take the last few minutes of the session for? And, if not, we will wrap it up and give you back 5 minutes of your day. And Steve, if you could just repeat the name of your last book.
Oh, yes. It's called Politics for Social Workers, a practical guide to effecting change.
Thank you. Great.
And feel free, right? You don't have to go out and buy it. Get your library to get a copy. Right? Don't feel that you have to spend money out of your own pocket.
That's a wonderful point.
Don't steal it from a PDF online. Ghettos, Tramps, and Welfare Queens is the book about poverty in film.
Absolutely.
Lots of pictures in that one, as he says, as an incentive. So make no mistake, it is absolutely not a picture book, alas.